Hi, I'm Bill Mounts, and Dr. Blomberg asked me if I would do a short video on some of the themes and things that I've learned from the Pastoral Epistles, so I'm glad to do that. The first question was, how did I get interested in the pastorals? And I wish there was some really cool spiritual kind of reason that God had said, Bill, work on the pastorals. That's not at all what happened. The publisher came to me and said, we need someone to write a commentary on the pastorals. Would you do it? And I went, okay. I'm very glad in retrospect that I did do it, but there was no great, driving force in me to work on these 13 chapters. In retrospect, I think I know what the Lord was doing, was that I have a ministry called biblicaltraining.org, and we're moving world-class education into the church. And one of the things we're working on is a leadership track, and the pastorals and the commentary become the theological basis for what we're doing in the ministry. So I know from the Lord's point of view that it was very specific that I was supposed to work on the pastorals. I just didn't know it at the time. But anyway, what is one principle of leadership that comes out of the pastorals? Well, that's a virtually impossible question to answer, because the bulk of what we know about leadership, biblical leadership, does come from the pastorals. And if the skeptics got their way and the pastorals were removed from the canon, we would be much the poorer when it comes to leadership as to what a leader in a church should be. But thankfully, God will not allow the pastorals to be removed. And we have this wonderful collection of teachings on leadership, and especially in 1 Timothy 3. If I were to say that there's one lesson about leadership in the pastorals, it's that character matters. This is part of the problem of seminary education. It was the problem when I was a seminary professor. It was a problem that we had. I really hope that in your situation you're dealing with it. But we spend so much time teaching people the facts so they can be an apt teacher, which is one of the qualifications. But I've never known anyone to get fired from their pastoral position because they couldn't parse Greek. Doesn't happen. It's all character issues, either character in the pastor, or not being able to recognize poor character in your leadership team, or whatever be the case. Character is absolutely paramount. And so when you go to 1 Timothy 3, it says, starting verse 2, an overseer is to be above reproach. I really wish we had a colon after that. Because what happens is that Paul then starts to enumerate all of the character qualities of someone who's above reproach. Not perfect, but certainly not someone who doesn't share any of these qualities. But it says, what does it mean to be above reproach? Well, in the NIV, the first one is faithful to his wife. This is the husband of one woman passage. It's not saying an elder can't have been divorced. That's simply nowhere in the text. But it does mean that in terms of your character, that you're faithful to your spouse. And I would say, if you're addicted to pornography, if you engage in excessive flirting, all these kinds of things, you're not faithful. And you're not eligible to be a leader in the church. So character issues, faithful, temperate, self-controlled. You're in charge of your emotions. You respond. You don't react to things. You're self-controlled. You're respectable. You're hospitable. You're a people person. You don't sit in a corner between services and talk with the other elders about management issues. You get to know your people. You have them over for dinner. You build relationships. You're hospitable. Able to teach. Yes, that is one of the qualifications of a leadership. We kind of got that down though in seminary, don't we? Yeah. Although I would say we give you a lot of content, but we don't generally tell you how to teach, which is a thing that needs to be learned in your Christian ed classes. Not given to drunkenness. Okay, the false teachers were drunks. And it's interesting, in 1 Timothy 5, it's clear that what Timothy has done is said, look, I'm going to so distance myself from the false teachers. I'm not going to drink anything. And Timothy had a weak stomach, and Paul said, no, you need to keep drinking this wine and we'll kill the bacteria. But don't get drunk, but don't completely stay away from wine. See, Timothy is going overboard to really be a good leader in the church. But you're not to be a drunk. You're not violent or gentle, not quarrelsome. I mean, you need to be able to engage in a good debate. Elder meetings should a free interchange of ideas, and no ideas should be squelched. But at the end of the day, you're not going to be quarrelsome about it. Not a lover of money. And then it goes on to other things in terms of being a manager and things like that. But the point is, the bulk of Paul's instructions to Timothy about the future leaders of the church has to do with their character. Now, character cannot be taught, it can only be caught. And I really hope that you're in a situation where you have a mentor. Or a mentor, another staff person, someone you can build a series of relationships with, because you won't really know your own character. You certainly won't know the character of people that are coming into leadership in your church until you give them power. Power is what shows what a person is really like. So the 7-minute manager is a good policy. Give yourself, ask for a little bit of power, teaching a church, being responsible for something. The future leaders in your church, a little bit of power at a time, because it's only when you give people power that you will start to see what their character really is. So the dominant requirement of a leader that comes out of the pastorals is that of character. What about the issue of Christian formation? There's a lot of very personal stuff, especially in 2 Timothy. But there's a passage in 1 Timothy that I just love. Paul has been writing to Timothy, but he knows the church is reading over his shoulder, and that's okay. But in chapter 4, Paul kind of forgets about the Ephesian church and he starts getting very, very personal. And down in verse 13, he says, devote yourself to the public reading of Scripture, to the preaching, to teaching. And then in verse 14, he says, do not neglect your gift, which was given you through prophecy when the body of elders laid their hands on you. Now, why would Paul tell Timothy that? I think Timothy was Paul's best friend. Paul uses affectionate language for Timothy more than anyone else. He's part of his inner circle. Why would he say, now don't neglect your gift? Well, I think Paul knows that Ephesus is a real mess, and Timothy is really struggling. Now, this is not an easy task. Timothy is full of entrenched management, as I like to call it, and they're not going to let some whippersnapper come in and tell them what to do. And so Paul says, he keeps encouraging Timothy, don't neglect the gift. And then in verse 15, be diligent in these matters, give yourself wholly to them, so that everyone may see your progress. And then verse 16, and the Greek in verse 16 is miserable. Translations are really going to be different. Watch your life and doctrine closely. Persevere in them, it's the NIV. Because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. Now, obviously not work salvation, but this is working out your salvation with fear and trembling, Philippians 2. Paul knows that even Timothy can fail. Paul knows that even Timothy is not above temptation and falling into temptation. And that's why there's so many statements like this, especially in 1 Timothy, where Paul is saying, Timothy, please, please, please be careful. I would say it this way. If you think that you can't be tempted, Satan just won. In whatever area you think you can't be tempted, Satan goes, gotcha. I've got my beachhead. Now I know where to get at and to go after you with. No one is above temptation. And the minute you think that you can't fail, Satan's won. And I think Paul knows that. And so in terms of spiritual growth and formation, he's saying, Timothy, be careful. You, like everyone else, are susceptible to that. I had two really good friends when I was pastoring. One was a pastor of a very large church in town, and the other was a counselor, someone I had known for years and years as a friend. And I had breakfast every other Thursday morning with these men for 7 years. They were my accountability group because I wanted them to be. They knew me, they prayed for me, they loved me. And if at any point I thought I might be giving in a temptation, I know that those two men would tell me to my face. One of them went to the church, and the other one obviously didn't. He was pastoring. But I needed I don't really like the word accountability. I needed friends. I needed people who would mentor me. I needed people who knew me well and, if necessary, could speak truth into my life. So don't ever think you're above temptation, because you're not. And you need people who know you well to walk with you. What about mission, justice, things like that? There's a lot that the Pastorals has to say about that, but I've got to tell you, I think the strongest message in terms of mission in the Pastorals is that one of your mission fields is in the church. It's very important you hear that. Do not think that everyone in your church is a Christian. Just because you sit in a garage doesn't make you a car or a mechanic. I once asked a friend of mine who was a very aggressive pastor. You know who he is, but I'm not going to name him. It's a private conversation. And I said, "What drives you?" And he said, "I'm convinced the church is full of people going to hell." And I thought, well, that's kind of strong. Until I started pastoring, and then I realized you can't assume broad stroke that these people are Christians. You, in fact, I think, have to assume that your mission field is there, that the doctrine of the remnant was true in the Old Testament, is true in the church today. It's only a remnant of the visible are the true believers. Don't ever forget that. The key to understanding the pastorals is to know that what you're seeing is the fulfillment of Paul's prophecy. At the end of Paul's third missionary journey, he's on his way to Jerusalem. He stops at Miletus, the port city of Ephesus. The elders come down from the Ephesian church. And in Acts 20, starting at verse 29, Paul says to them, "I know that after I leave, savage wolves will come in among you and not spare your flock." Wow. Could you imagine being told that? Once I'm gone, the wolves are coming in. And then verse 30, "Even from your own number." In other words, from within the church, men will arise and distort the truth in order to draw away disciples after them. So be on your guard. I think Paul's talking about the leadership. Now, yes, men and women alike will attack you as the pastor. They will gossip, they will slander. In my more cynical moments, I'd say that slander is the native tongue of the church. Man, if people would just go to the person who's offended them or the person that they have an issue with and not go talk to everyone else, but just talk. Wouldn't that be wonderful to be in a church like that? Man, I'd give my right hand, so to speak, to be in that kind of church. But people don't do that, and they gossip and they slander, and then when you give them power, they will sometimes go after you. And that's not just me speaking from personal experience, although that is my experience. I've just talked to hundreds of pastors who have the same experience, that wolves are always in the church. And they're always waiting for a vulnerable point so that they can attack. And usually they want power. So please remember that the mission field, there's a mission field that's out there. There's also a mission field in your church. You cannot assume that everyone is a true follower of Jesus Christ. The final question is, what's the one thing you take away from the pastorals? And there's no way for me to answer that question. Not because I spent 14 years on a commentary on it, but the pastorals are all different. Just because we call them pastorals doesn't make them the same. 1 Timothy is a letter to Timothy, and the church in Ephesus is meant to be reading it over his shoulder. That's why the last verse is plural, "Grace be with you all." Because Paul knows there's tremendous issues in the leadership structure in the Ephesian church, and he wants Timothy to take care of it. So it's that kind of letter. And the takeaway there is character. That character really matters. But Titus was written after a new missionary journey to Crete. It's the kind of letter you write to a brand new church. And two of the greatest salvation passages in the Bible are in Titus 2 and 3. If you're going to preach evangelistic services, don't forget Titus 2 and 3. That's the takeaway there. And on 2 Timothy is a totally different. It's a really personal letter. Paul knows he's at the end of his life. He knows that he's going to be found guilty, even though the initial part of the trial went well. And it is just a real look at the relationship that Paul and Timothy have. In fact, one of the assignments I always had when I was teaching the pastorals is go through especially 2 Timothy 1. And every single verse is a form of encouragement. And go through and try to identify how Paul is encouraging Timothy. It's really magnificent, all the different ways in which Paul is coming alongside his best friend and encouraging him. But I think the passage that I want to leave you with is 2 Timothy in chapter 4. And starting at verse 7, Paul says, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. How many people in ministry have we heard about that started strong and ended badly? I just heard of another one just the other day. It's just like it's a never-ending thing. But look what Paul says. I fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. What's missing? Paul skipped something. His death. I love that about the passage. I finished the race. I fought the fight. I finished the race. The only thing that's left for me is my crown of righteousness. You go, well, Paul, you're going to have to die to get that crown of righteousness. Yeah, but death is whatever. That's not the point. And I love his perspective that I've done what God has called me to do. I was talking to a good friend of mine who's a world-class scholar. You know who it is. But again, it's a private conversation. And I was asking him how he was feeling because he knew he was dying at this point. And he said, you know, Bill, it's been a good run. I went, wow. You're going to die of Parkinson's. And the only thing you have to say is, it's been a good run. May that be our estimation of our life, where death is not an issue and our days are numbered. The Lord will bring us home when he's ready to bring us home. And may we be faithful until that time. That'd be my prayer for you all. I want to add, just as a final note, by the way, that Craig and I, Dr. Blomberg and I, are actually very good friends. What you may not know is that it took me a little bit longer to finish my PhD than I had planned, and I ended up moving in with Craig and his wife, Fran. So we lived together for 6 months in a flat in Aberdeen, and I know a lot of stuff about Dr. Blomberg. I mean, really interesting stuff. So if you want to know, just give me a call. No, don't. Thanks.